Good morning, everyone. We will start again now with a panel on Islamic law and gender equality. We have here Dr. Rita Stefan and Dr. Gail, and Ariana will be presenting Dr. Amir Sambul's paper, and we have here Dr. Aisha. Okay, enjoy. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to welcome you to this panel on Islamic law and gender equity. First, my name is Rita Stefan. I am currently a visiting researcher at Georgetown University, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I'm also a foreign affairs officer with the State Department working on Syria and Lebanon. I did my PhD at UT Austin, Hook'em Horn, with Munira Sharad, and the topic was women's activism in Lebanon. I am honored to be with the panelists today, and I would like to introduce Dr. Gail Buttroff. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Kansas. She currently teaches courses on Middle East and North African politics, Islam and politics, and quantitative research methods. Her research interests focus broadly on elections and opposition politics in the Middle East and North Africa. She is working on a book project examining how perceptions of regime legitimacy affect opposition party strategy in authoritarian elections. In addition, Buttroff is working with colleagues at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and University College London at a large multi-stage and multidisciplinary project examining obstacles to the implementation of family law reforms and the improvement of women's status in the MENA region. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Iowa. Please help me welcome Dr.
Okay, thank you. Do I have my slides? Maybe. Okay, I'll start talking. I think. Oh, here. Am I? I think they were Abdul Qadir. Oh, here.
This one?
Yeah. Okay, so it may take a moment for them to show up here. I have them here. So this project is with my co-author Rahma Abdul Qadir at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and it's part of a larger project looking at family law reforms in North Africa and what are the obstacles to the implementation of family law reforms where they've been enacted. And given the obstacles to the implementation of the law, what then is the ability of such national level reforms to improve the status of women? So as was mentioned by Dr. Stefan, this is kind of one paper in a series of papers I'm working on regarding this issue. Most of the work has looked at Morocco, in particular the geographic distribution of court opinions. There's certainly this geographic dimension between rural and urban areas, and also issues of information at both the judicial level as well as at the individual level. This particular project is looking at individual attitudes and how those may pose an obstacle to the implementation of family law, but also then the improvement of women's status in North Africa. So the motivation comes for these projects, and this project I'll talk about today, comes from the fact that we have national level policies, okay, and reforms that are enacted and aimed at improving the status of women in the Arab world. And in particular, family law reforms and reforms to personal status laws, as well as gender quotas and so on. Right? So we have these national level policies and agendas for reform, but what are the impacts? And in particular, family and personal status laws have been the target of reform movements, as was mentioned in the keynote address, have been the target of reform movements at multiple levels, both from the executive level by the King of Morocco, the King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, the President of Algeria, but with varying success, okay? A good case is the example of Jordan versus Morocco, okay? Both kings had the desire to reform family laws, but only in Morocco were they successfully implemented. So, despite these public policy movement or reform movements to reform the public policies, and despite, in the case of Morocco and Egypt, the enactment of progressive public policies, okay, why does the status of women continue to lag behind the rest of the world? And this particular paper fits in a larger literature within political science that has aimed to explain why, one, Muslim majority countries lag behind non-Muslim majority countries on key gender equality measures. Okay, women in the non-agricultural labor force, women in the cabinet, women in parliament, and so on. But also, an important subset of that literature looks at why Arab Muslim majority countries lag behind Muslim majority countries and then lag behind the rest of the world. So within this literature, there's really four main, not the only, but these are the main theories behind why it is that the Arab countries lag behind other Muslim, non-Arab Muslim majority countries, as well as non-Muslim countries in the world. Okay, the first is a theory about the oil curse. Okay, Michael Ross argues that it's really a link between oil production, okay, and given the nature of oil production, women are kept out of the labor force, and this reinforces patriarchal norms and results in lower female representation in the social, economic, and political spheres. I'm going to go through these quite quickly because as Dr. Stefan noted, I have a long paper and only 20 minutes. Okay, so these are just the general. The second one is about liberal democratic institutions, in particular gender quotas. What are the ability of gender quotas to offset the effect of the oil-based economies and improve the status of women? We've seen, and Dr. Wellborn can talk more about this, is a number of countries in the Arab world have adopted gender quotas. Algeria is actually one of the top countries in the world now in terms of the percentage of women in its parliament. It's now 33%, 1/3. Another large literature is from Norris and co-authors, Norris and Engelhardt, about culture. Okay, that the reason Muslim majority countries lag behind the rest of the world in terms of gender equality, as well as why the Arab world in particular lags behind the rest of the world, is their political culture, right? And in particular, Norris and her co-authors focus in on Muslim religious identity and how that affects attitudes towards gender equality. So that it's Islam and particular levels of religiosity within countries that then affect how well countries do on these key gender equality dimensions. A final set of theories, one well represented by the work of Dr. Munira Sherrard, is about kin-based values. That the idea here is patriarchal kin-based values and social structures influence attitudes towards gender equality. And this is where we pick up and build on the work of Munira Sherrard in looking at how these kin-based values affect attitudes towards gender roles in the political, social, and economic spheres. So a great quote from a paper about Dono and Russet says, Islamic culture in particular may not be a major impediment to achieving women's rights, but something about Arab states is. Right? So the question is, what is it about Arab states? Right? The problem with a lot of the previous research as it is is that it's only really looked at what it is about Arab states in a very crude way. Okay? One, it's usually a dummy variable, a dichotomous measure of whether or not the country falls in the Middle East and North Africa. Okay? Whether or not the country is Arab or not, in a cross-national analysis of countries on gender equality. Okay? Also, there continues to be this focus on religiosity and the importance of religion and God in one's life. Okay? And this literature largely ignores, in trying to explain what it is about the Middle East in particular, the Arab states in particular, largely ignores variation within the Middle East and North Africa. Okay? Tunisia scores better than Morocco and Egypt. Okay? North Africa in general scores better than the countries of the Levant and the Gulf. Okay? And so this literature really has not got at or teased out what it is about Arab states in particular. Okay? And this is where we try and make a small contribution in understanding what it is about Arab states. So we argue that it is kin-based values. Okay? These tribal traditional values that preface kin over the individual. We build from the work of Munira Sherard and emphasize the role of these traditional kin-based social structures and their subsequent values, okay, that are embedded in society. We examine how such attitudes and values act as a barrier to the improvement of women's status in the Middle East and North Africa. We focus not on the national level, but at the individual level, and looking at the effect of these values on attitudes towards gender equality in the economic, social, and political spheres. And how, again, these values act as a barrier to the improvement of women's status. Okay, so again, the motivation for this set of papers is about family law reforms and their ability of the family law reforms to improve the status of women. Okay, a well-known quote is that, family law is the key to the gates of freedom and human rights for women. Okay, so why we've seen such emphasis on the national and subnational levels for reforming these family laws is that they're seen as incredibly important for improving the status of women in the Middle East and North Africa. Okay. However, even with reforms, we've seen subnational obstacles to, sorry, there's a typo, obstacles, pose obstacles to the implementation and improvement in women's status. Some of the key obstacles we've seen are illiteracy, economic dependence, lack of information about the reforms, and resistance from local officials, okay, and in particular, judges. For example, in Morocco, the female literacy rate is about 58%, and in Egypt it's about 66%, okay? Right? With high levels of literacy, that in turn affects the ability of women to understand the new rights granted to them under the new family law reforms, right? Economic dependence, that may in turn affect a woman's willingness to ask for a divorce, okay, because of her dependence economically on men. Lack of information, okay, in general about the reforms, what they entail. In the case of Morocco, the implementation has been left to the judiciary, and the ability of these reforms to achieve gender equality only protect women and children insofar as they're implemented by the judiciary, okay? But if the judiciary doesn't really understand the new laws or has a lot of information about what these laws entail, right, that affects the ability of them to be implemented in ways that affect, that improve the status of women. Okay, also, we've seen resistance from local officials, right? There's a couple of cases with, like Diane Singerman's work in Egypt talks about how objections to the reforms to the personal status laws, they express on the one hand Sharia-based concerns, but also very much non-Sharia-based concerns about how these reforms would affect the place of women in society, how judges put pressure on women to withdraw their cases for divorce, and so on. And underlying many of these obstacles are these patriarchal kin-based values, okay, right? Patriarchal kin-based values affect women's education, right, and then their illiteracy. They affect economic dependency. They affect the willingness of judges to implement the reforms in ways that are consistent, okay, or implement the law in ways that are consistent with the reforms. So they have both, these kin-based values have both both direct and indirect effects on the ability and the willingness of women to exercise these new rights granted to them under the reform. So one quote from a paper that sums up this quite well was that the family law is still very poorly known in rural areas and sometimes urban areas. Okay? Morocco has taken steps to implement training centers, establishment of separate family courts, and so on, but there is still this geographic dimension of information. Second, many male judges resist the application of the law. On the other hand, even when the family law guarantees women's rights, the impact of patriarchy, tradition, illiteracy, and ignorance may prevent women from invoking their rights or reporting crimes against them, such as rape, child abuse, sexual exploitation, and domestic violence. Right? So that these kin-based values can affect a woman's willingness to actually ask for a divorce, okay, because of the negative repercussions she may have at a societal level or within her own family, okay, and they may affect the willingness of a judge to rule in her favor. So how do we examine the effect of kin-based values? We use 2 waves of the World Value Surveys in Morocco and Egypt. The 4th wave of the survey was taken in 2000 in Egypt and 2001 in Morocco. And the 5th wave was administered in Morocco in 2008. And actually, I think it's 2007 and 2008 in Egypt. We have approximately 9,000 observations, 9,000 individual respondents across the 2 waves. We use logistic regression to look at the effects of kin-based values on attitudes towards gender equality with country and wave fixed effects. So the dependent variables, okay, attitudes towards gender equality. These are very common in the literature. The 3 main measures. 1, on the whole, men make better political leaders than women. Respondents are asked to strongly agree to strongly disagree. A university education is more important for a boy than a girl. Right? Again, strongly agree to disagree. And when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. Okay? We've dichotomized these, right, to 0, 1 variables, with 1 representing agree or strongly disagree, strongly agree or agree, okay, meaning that they have, gender inegalitarian attitudes, and 0 otherwise. So here is the proportion of respondents, okay, that strongly agreed or agreed with these statements, okay. We can see in the 4th wave, right, approximately 85% of respondents in Egypt agreed that on the whole men make better political leaders. In Morocco, it was much lower at 70% of the respondents agreed. And then we can see the changes from the between the 4th and 5th wave, okay, across that 6 or 7 year period, okay. This table in itself is very interesting, and I can come back to it in the questions and answer period. I'm just now kind of getting a handle on what is happening here. Okay, because as you can see here, the asterisks note okay, when you've had a significant change in the proportion of respondents that are agreeing or disagreeing with these three statements. Now, in Morocco, what we're seeing is something we would like to see, okay? That a decrease number, right? A decrease in the number of people that are holding attitudes inconsistent with gender equality values, right? And in some cases, it's quite stark, right? Especially regarding the jobs, okay? In Egypt, on the other hand, we see the opposite, okay? There's actually an increase overall, with the exception of the jobs, in gender inegalitarian attitudes, right? This is interesting. I have some preliminary theories and ideas about why this is, and I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A, but for now, let's just leave that. Okay, so this is the overview of what we're dealing with. Yeah, I know, it's, and I've also looked at this for other countries. We see a similar thing in Jordan with the case of Egypt. We have an actual increase in the proportion of people. So this is a different project. I have to leave it alone for now. Okay, so how we measure kin-based values. Okay, this is the most difficult part of this project. A lot of the literature has conflated patriarchy and gender equality for good reason, okay? And measured patriarchy with these dependent variables, okay? But the values and attitudes we're talking about are more than just patriarchy, okay? They're ideas about the importance of the family, importance of the tribe or the larger kin group over the individual, and we've attempted to kind of capture these broader kin-based values with the following measures. Now, any suggestions and criticisms are more than welcome, okay? This is the first go at trying to measure these. We're certainly limited by the data that is available, okay? But we would like to continue to work on ways to improve the measures of these kin-based values, okay? So one is the obedience as an important child quality, okay? As opposed to creativity, individuality, and so on. The second is about, that it's important for a child to have this traditional family structure of a mother and father. Being a housewife is just as fulfilling as, saying, having a career. Whether or not someone disapproves of females as single parents. And the fifth is that the government should take on more responsibility. So respondents were asked, okay, do you think that the individual should take on more responsibility or that the government should take on more responsibility? And the idea with this one is that many governments in the Middle East and North Africa, since independence, have taken on the roles of more or less, they're considered neo-patrimonial regimes, okay? That they've taken on this almost father figure-like role for their citizens. So this is, in my opinion, the most problematic measure, and I've run everything without it, and things do not change much without the government responsibility. Okay, so what do we find? Here are the results of the logistic regression. These are in the odds ratio, so anything above 1 indicates an increased likelihood, anything below 1 increased to decreased likelihood. I'll take that away and just tell you in words. So, regarding obedience as an important child quality, right? Those people that agreed that this was an important quality for their children were more likely to believe that men make better political leaders and men should have more right to a job than women, okay? But it had no effect on education. Regarding the traditional family structure, this also negatively influenced attitudes towards gender equality, right? Those people that strongly agreed that a child needs a mother and father, okay, were more likely to believe men make better political leaders, university education is more important for a man than a woman, and when jobs are scarce, men should have priority over women. So this was negatively affecting attitudes toward gender equality across the three models. How am I on time? I'm okay? Okay, good. For housewife, whether or not people believe housewife is fulfilling as having a career, this made people more likely to believe men have more right to university education and jobs, but it had no effect on whether or not people believed men make better political leaders than women. And for those disapproving of women as single parents, this again negatively influenced attitudes towards gender equality across the three models. Finally, whether or not people thought the government or the individual should take more responsibility. Okay, those that agreed that the government should take more responsibility, it had an effect, but substantively, it's very small. Okay, and as I mentioned before, when you drop this variable from the regressions, the coefficients and the significance do not change very much at all. And it had some effect on the control variables, but regardless, and you can see here, it's more or less 1, meaning that it doesn't really affect anything, even though it's statistically significant. So in terms of the control variables we included, right, we're situating ourselves in this larger literature, which has primarily focused on Muslim religious identity and religiosity, okay, how religious one believes, okay, and we find no effect. Right. These religiosities the religiosity measures that Norris and Engelhardt have used to look at this had no effect. I can come back to this issue regarding whether or not this is a good measure of religiosity in the Q&A. Also, the number of children, single, never married, marital status. Okay, these had no influences on the dependent variables. Regarding positive influences, whether or not someone is a female, okay, unsurprisingly influences in a positive way attitudes towards gender equality, education, right, increase education levels, increase the likelihood that someone's going to hold gender or egalitarian attitudes. And when someone was divorced or separated, this also increased the likelihood that they would hold gender egalitarian values, meaning that they were likely to disagree or strongly disagree that men make better political leaders and that men should have priority for jobs when jobs are scarce. Okay, this had whether or not someone was divorced or separated had no effect on attitudes about university education. Negative influence was primarily employment status, right? And this is consistent with larger literatures about attitudes towards gender equality, right? If you were a housewife, okay, you were less likely to hold gender egalitarian values, right? If you were self-employed, it had a negative influence. And if you were unemployed, okay, you were less likely to hold gender egalitarian values across the three models. Okay, I have 30 seconds. So mentalities are slow to change. This is a quote from Fatima Siddiqui and Naji that really captures what we're seeing here. Okay, that you can have progressive policy making at the national level, okay, but right, mentalities at the subnational level are going to be slow to change. Okay, and those mentalities can pose a barrier to the ability of the national level reforms to improve the status of women, right? We find that kin-based values do negatively influence attitudes towards gender equality, and in particular, we don't find any effect for religiosity, how religious an individual is, how important is religion in one's life, and how important is God in one's life, right? These do not have an effect in any of the three models for attitudes towards gender equality. Okay. In conclusion, right, our preliminary results really suggest that these values do continue to pose a major barrier to the implementation of new policies such as the family law reform. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to introduce next the paper that will be read by Ariana, but is written by Amira Sumbul Amira is a professor of history at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar, specializing in history of modern Egypt, Islamic history and law, women, gender, and Islam. She's the author of several books, including The New Mamluks, Egyptian Society and Modern Feudalism, Women, the Family, and Divorce Laws in Islamic History, The Creation of a Medical Profession in Egypt, 1800 to 1922, The Memoirs of Abbas Hilmi II, Sovereign of Egypt, Women of the Jordan, Islam, Labor and the Law, and many more. Please join me in welcoming Ariana as she reads Amira's paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, as you can tell, I'm not Dr. Sonbul, unfortunately. She was unable to join us today, so I'll be presenting the main ideas of her paper rather than reading it in her absence. My name is Ariana Marnicio, and I am the research assistant for the Women and Human Rights program here at the Baker Institute. I will do my best to present her work and answer any questions about the main ideas, but if you have more specific questions, please approach me at lunchtime, and I'll be able to give you her personal contact information. The theme of today's conference is the evolving roles of women in the Arab world, and it is precisely this definition and perception of women's role that Sonbul analyzes in her paper, entitled Contextualizing Legal Change, Addressing Normative Paradigms and the Constraints of Equal Rights for Women in the Arab World. According to Sonbul, the normative discourse sees Muslim women, both past and present, as subservient to men, fathers, and husbands, with little agency prior to the establishment of the modern state. In an effort to preserve tradition and cultural values, these dated policies and stances are imposed by lawmakers and society upon women, who are responsible for both the preservation of honor and tradition in Arab culture. Careful analysis, however, of the lived realities of Arab women in the past paints a very different picture that contradicts the dominant paradigms and show that women had much more agency in the past than we give them credit for. Her paper offers a re-examination of legal sources, particularly Egyptian court proceedings, to address Arab women's history in its totality, to show that disparities and contradictions exist between legal and theological discourses confining women and women's actual experiences. Sonbul aims to challenge the patriarchal discourses that see modernity as a threat to Islam and Islamic traditions, and use that threat as an excuse to limit the implementation of women's rights and equality. Court records provide us with the images of women as craftsmen and traders all over the Arab world. We find goldsmiths in Jerusalem, weavers, midwives, and peddlers who sold clothes, fabric, footwear, cosmetics, and household goods. Women also owned grinding mills, olive orchards, and coffee houses. Court records speak of labor disputes and litigation involving female leaders of positions, weaving, and entertainment guilds. They are clearly active in the economic realm according to these court proceedings. These same patterns of labor force participation can be seen today, with women serving as teachers, doctors, executives, ambassadors, engineers, and nurses, to name a few. Today, women constitute an important percentage of wage earners, and the number of households led by women is increasing. For example, in Egypt, 25% of all families in 2006 were financially supported by a woman, and that number has jumped to 35% today. Legal codes in many Muslim countries include rules that limit a woman's ability to take jobs that are considered hard labor or dangerous, and often include night shifts, which means the possibilities of high-paying jobs and earning overtime income are denied to women. These rules are based on fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence or theology arguments, and the general belief that women are the weaker sex and need to be protected, a division based on biological differences. Modern labor laws and social discourses confine women's access to jobs that could be considered hard labor. These jobs, according to labor laws, are not suited to women's nature, which includes jobs that require intense physical exertion. Interestingly, the laws that do not extend protection to the very jobs that women often hold, which could be considered hard labor, such as agricultural work and domestic labor. women constitute almost the totality of domestic labor worldwide, withstanding hardships and often insecurities and possible physical harm in order to earn a wage and support their families. According to Sonbul, not only did women work, but they chose to invest their earnings back into the community. Women, including those of the middle and lower classes, are recorded to have donated money to start religious endowments or waqfs. Randy de Gilham's study of these endowments in late autumn in Damascus indicates that women are equal participants in the creation and management of these endowments. An idea also confirmed by Mary Ann Fay's study of Egyptian Mamluk households. To create a religious endowment, women must have been in command of property, wealth they inherited, invested, traded, and earned. Many women's decision to enter the workforce, both in the past and the present day, are informed by cultural expectations about women's role in the family as both mothers and wives. Sonbul provides specific examples from Egyptian court proceedings that prove that women had significant agency and choice in marriage. In the first example she provides, a woman stipulates in her marriage contract that if her husband ever even considered to take a second wife, that she would divorce him. In another example, if the husband decided to move their family home without her permission, that was also grounds for divorce. These were all stipulations she made in the marriage contract prior to the agreement. In another example, a wife brings her husband to court for not providing the financial assistance that he had promised in the marriage contract, and she was able to receive compensation and hold him accountable. These examples show that the courts honored women's opinions and that they were able to earn their rights through the legal process. Today, even though Islamic rules of marriage and divorce are followed, there are major differences in the application and expectations from the law. For example, in 1980s Egypt, the inclusion of a law that described a man's decision to take a second wife is considered harmful for the first wife, and therefore grounds for her to file for divorce and preserve her financial rights. This, however, was fought and revoked on the basis that limiting polygamy was against the Sharia. Much of today's legal rulings and social perceptions are informed by Islamic law and Islamic jurisprudence. Fiqh, however, represents the opinion of a select upper-class group of male scholars, Muslim clerics, rather than the way people actually live their lives. It is believed that Islam decreed for women that their lives be confined to the home, that they require their husband's permission to leave, and that she can only leave the home to work if there is a dire need. Fiqh discourses carefully emphasize the biological distinctions between men and women that construct the role of nurturer for women and the role of provider for men. Protection of women becomes a basic principle in the construction of laws guiding gender relations, and this is the case for personal status laws, labor laws, nationality laws, and criminal codes. Modern Islamic jurisprudence has diverged significantly from medieval jurisprudence by making the family the center of the discourse. The focus on family can be seen from the most liberal to the most conservative scholars and jurists. Medieval lawmakers and theologians spoke of husband, wife, children, and marriage. Family as a concept and subject of law and center of legal discourse begins to appear in the 19th century with the introduction of French law that considered the father to be the legal head of the family. The modern state was interested in organizing society through the legal codification and construction of power relations between it and society. That is what took place within the new family cell, which was recognized by the law and newly promulgated constitutions as the basic unit of society in which the father was recognized as the legal authority. Patriarchy was introduced as much through fiqh discourse as through 19th century Victorianism and European philosophy toward gender that saw women as covered or protected by her husband and made her and the children dependents of him. A good example of this idea comes from the system of family ID cards required in Arab countries. All of the male heads of families, which are only permitted to women who have been widowed, and families, so the ID cards are given, men have to apply for them soon after they get married for the entire family, for his wife, for his children. And women can only apply for them if they prove to be widowed or individuals. Placing fathers as legal heads of the families allows them to limit the rights of the other members of the family. The general belief that the father owns the daughter helps keep daughters' and sisters' movements and actions controlled by the family. The laws codified by the patriarchal state balanced out gains that women made by holding on to fundamental and basic relations that constructed a system of inequality between men and women. The introduction of what became known as personal status laws is very much part of this new patriarchal system. A 1937 Egyptian court case that defines the term personal status frames this approach to gender and law. By personal status is meant the totality of what differentiates one human being from another in natural or family characteristics, according to which the law based legal principles in regards to his social life. Tying women to family in legal codes emphasizes biological differences, a discourse built on an undisputed physical reality and makes changing discriminatory laws very hard to achieve. It is important that this discourse itself is dismantled. This can be achieved by illustrating that the modern family is a construct of the modern state, and that the idea of biological nature as limiting women's agency is a construction of modern fiqh discourse. Marriage contracts were written between individuals, and they continue to be so today, but legal codes since the introduction of personal status in Egypt in 1921, and from whence they spread to other Arab and Muslim countries, consider family to be the basic social unit and center of laws and legal discourses. As long as the normative understanding separates modern from pre-modern, which categorizes modern to be an innovation and pre-modern to be Islamic, it is hard to change the laws given the corollary that altering or improving women's rights is a direct challenge to Islam. Historical research has shown that the dichotomy of modern versus traditional, liberated women versus oppressed women, is not supported by the lived realities of Muslim women before modernity. Women have always taken active roles in the workforce and have participated in the economic support of their communities and families. Thank you.
Well, we're doing great on time now. Next, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Aisha Chaudhry. She's an assistant professor of Islamic Studies and Gender Studies in the Department of Classical, Near East, and Religious Studies and the Institute for Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Her teaching and research interests include Islamic law, Quranic exegesis, and feminist hermeneutics. She is the author of Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition, Ethics, Law, and the Muslim Discourse on Gender, which was recently published by Oxford University Press. This book explores the relationship of modern Muslims to the inherited Islamic tradition through a study of legal and exegetical discussions of wife beating in the pre-modern and modern periods. She holds a BA and an MA from the University of Toronto and a PhD from New York University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chaudhry.
Thank you very much. Oh, and it's working, the slide. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I want to thank Dr. Shalaby, Ariana, and Whitney for the invitation and for being so wonderful with figuring out all the logistics and everything of this trip. So I really appreciate that. And I also want to thank you all for this panel, which the papers are extremely complimentary. I'm used to being on panels where they're not, so that's really wonderful. So I think we can have some good conversation at the end of this. Okay, so I don't know why there's stamps at the top of that slide, but PowerPoint wouldn't let me not have them, so that's there. So I'm just letting you know that. It looks a little weird, but whatever. Okay, so am I going to press this thing? Or am I going to? Okay, awesome, perfect, thank you. Okay, so in 1979, the UN General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Elimination on All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, hereafter referred to as CEDAW. Many countries that ratified this convention did so with reservations. In all, 28 nations expressed reservations to Article 16 of CEDAW, which seeks to eliminate discrimination against women in marriage by affording them equal rights and responsibilities in the contracting, duration, and dissolution of marriage. So Article 16 reads, "Parties shall take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in all matters relating to marriage and family relations, and in particular shall ensure, on a basis of equality of men and women, A, the same right to enter into marriage, B, the same right freely to choose a spouse, and to enter into marriage only with their free and full consent, and C, the same rights and responsibilities during marriage and at its dissolution." Of the 28 countries that expressed reservations to this article, 20 are Muslim-majority countries. And 14 of these countries specifically cite Islamic Sharia, in quotations, Islamic Sharia or Islamic law, as the reason for their reservations to CEDAW more broadly and to Article 16 in particular. It appears then that religion, and in particular Islam and Islamic law, is the primary reason given by nation states for not fully approving, accepting, and upholding a convention that is designed to protect a historically vulnerable group of people, women, against unjust, prejudicial treatment. Two other countries that cite religion for their reservations to Article 16 are Israel and Singapore. Israel expresses reservations to CEDAW due to, quote, "various religious communities in Israel," end quote, "whose laws on personal status do not conform with the provisions of that article," end quote. The reference to religion in Israel's reservations is vague. It could be referring to Muslims living in Israel, but more likely is referring to the Orthodox Jewish communities in which patriarchy is deeply entrenched. Interestingly, Singapore cites religious pluralism, tolerance, and diversity for the reasons for their reservations to Article 16, arguing that given, and here's a quotation, "the context of Singapore's multiracial and multi-religious society and the need to respect the freedom of minorities to practice their religious and personal laws, the Republic of Singapore reserves the right not to apply the provisions of Article 2 and 16, where compliance with these provisions would be contrary to their religious or personal laws." It is worth noting that in citing religious tolerance as the reason for gender discrimination in marriage, both Singapore and Israel are pitting one liberal democratic value against another, justifying gender discrimination in the name of respecting the religious beliefs of communities that discriminate against women. This is the same logic used by some Muslim-majority nation states, who hold that, number one, the freedom to practice one's religion trumps international moral concerns, and two, the legitimate religious practice might be essentially patriarchal and opposed to gender equality inside the family and out. In the case of Muslim-majority countries, the overriding concern is clearly that international law not impinge on the full and unencumbered practice of Islamic law, which these countries portray as monolithic and opposed to gender equality. Several countries have expressed reservations to Article 16 of CEDAW on the grounds of Islamic law or Sharia, without specifying exactly which aspects of Article 16 contradict specific Islamic legal injunctions. Bahrain, for example, expresses its reservations to Article 16 using vague language such as, quote, "insofar as it is incompatible with the provisions of the Islamic Sharia," end quote. Among these vague proclamations, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, stands out for providing extraordinary detail to justify its reservations. The UAE accepts the provisions of CEDAW only, quote, "insofar as they are not in conflict with the principles of the Sharia," and then explains that reservation by stating, so that's the first line, the UAE will abide by the provisions of this article insofar as they are not in conflict with the principles of the Sharia. The UAE considers that the payment of a dower and of support after divorce is an obligation of the husband, and the husband has a right to divorce, just as the wife has her independent financial security and her full rights to her property and is not required to pay her husband's or her own expenses out of her own property. The Sharia makes a woman's right to divorce conditional on a judicial decision in a case in which she has been harmed. Presumably, this statement is in response to Article 16, especially A and C, which state that both men and women will have the same right to enter into marriage, the same rights and responsibilities during marriage, and at its dissolution. The article seeks to remove the Article 16 seeks to remove the power imbalance inherent in a relationship in which one party grants the other money for either marriage or divorce. The UAE reservation mentions that the payment of the dower and the support after divorce are parallel obligations placed upon the husband. Mentioning the dower and support after divorce as obligations paints these two acts as a responsibility and a burden that husbands bear as a consequence of marriage, rather than as a right and privilege that affords husbands power over their wives. The power imbalance captured in the act of one party giving the other money and contracting and dissolving the marriage introduces and instantiates a patriarchal power dynamic between husbands and wives. Furthermore, though the statement does not specify the exact amount a husband must pay his wife for dower and support in divorce, any amount will reinforce the power imbalance, either symbolically, if the amount is negligible, or tangibly, if the amount is substantial. This power imbalance is acknowledged in the UAE statement. Immediately after stating that husbands are obligated to pay women a dower and support after divorce, the reservation states that husbands have the right to divorce. This is in contrast to wives, whose right to divorce is conditional on a judicial decision in a case in which she has been harmed. So in the UAE, husbands can divorce their wives at will without judicial oversight, while wives' right to divorce is constrained by a judicial petition and further by the condition that they are able to demonstrate harm in marriage. Granting husbands and wives asymmetrical rights to divorce treats women unfairly in at least 3 ways. First, it allows husbands to exit a marriage at will, allowing them to use divorce as a weapon to extract compliance. Second, it traps women in marriages from which they cannot exit unless an external judicial body validates their desire or need for a divorce. And third, it limits the ability of a judicial body to approve a wife's petition for divorce to instances in which there is demonstrable harm. The UAE reservation concludes by stating that the power imbalance that the UAE wishes to uphold derives directly from the Sharia. The relevant text reads, and the quote is still up there, the Sharia makes a woman's right to divorce conditional on a judicial decision in a case in which she has been harmed. That this claim is made in the name of a sacred, but nevertheless simplistic and vague notion of Sharia is important. It allows a reservation to, 1, allocate marital rights and privileges based on a patriarchal model that privileges men and discriminates against women, and B, to portray this position as normative and authoritative. Such patriarchal visions of Islam and Islamic law are key to enacting gender-equal reforms in many Muslim-majority countries. It is my contention that attempts to institute gender-equal norms and laws in countries like the UAE requires us to take their religious arguments seriously and to challenge them on religious grounds. This paper is a case study for how this can be done effectively, using the UAE as an example. I rely on the UAE's stated reservations to CEDAW's Article 16, as well as the language used to describe an ideal marital relationship in its personal status code, the penal codes legislating a husband's right to punish his wife or wives, and a judge's ruling in the case of domestic violence to argue that religious reasoning is central to these cases. Likewise, they can be challenged on religious grounds, since modern Muslim scholars have offered valid alternative notions of Islam and Islamic law that are gender egalitarian. The UAE is well positioned to spearhead gender-equal family law reform in the Middle East because it has already reformed some of its laws to be more gender equal, even if this has meant breaking from the classical Islamic legal tradition. Making family law gender equal will create the legal space necessary to criminalize all forms of domestic violence and will help countries ratify CEDAW's Article 16 without reservations. There is already a strong movement to combat domestic violence in the UAE, and the problem of DV is getting national attention. On March 30th, 2014, an article in The National noted that the domestic violence rate in Abu Dhabi, for example, had tripled in 3 years. At the moment, there is internal and external pressure to reform UAE's domestic violence laws, and such reform would respond to calls from people from within the UAE, citizens and residents alike, and from the broader Muslim community, as well as from the international community. So at present, this is not going to be surprising to anybody, domestic violence is not criminalized in the UAE. To the contrary, the physical discipline of wives is enshrined as a legal right for husbands in both the Personal Status Code and the Penal Code of the UAE. This right is predicated on a conception of gender inequality in marriage as a virtuous norm. Article 56 of the Personal Status Code, the Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya, lists 3 core obligations of a wife, the first of which is that she obey her husband. So this is a quote from Article 56. So rights of a husband over his wife are: 1, she obey him in accordance with custom, ma'ruf, oversee his house and protect his family, and 3, nurse his children unless something prevents her from this. The article goes on to argue for the ontological superiority of men over women, citing several Quranic verses, including a verse from chapter 2, verse 228, and also chapter 4, verse 34. The article provides a single interpretation of each of these verses, seeing Quran 2:228 as granting men a degree over women, and reading 434 to suggest that God prefers men over women. Article 56 endorses a theory of gender complementarity over and against a theory of gender equality, saying that God has created men and women for different purposes and differentiated between them based on their gender, natural disposition, and physical characteristics. The article mentions a prophetic report in which Muhammad was asked about the rights of a wife over their husband. He replied that he feeds her when he eats, clothes her when he clothes himself, and that he not hit her in the face, and not disfigure her, and not abandon her except in the house. The article further states that women are not permitted to leave their homes without their husband's permission, and that husbands are required to discipline their wives and correct a wife's behavior when she makes a mistake or is disobedient. As can be seen from this article, the UAE's Personal Status Code relies on religious sources to make an easy connection between the complementarity model of gender and husbands' privilege to discipline wives. These privileges include the right of husbands to hit their wives so long as they do not hit them in the face or disfigure them. The UAE's penal code reinforces the husbandly privilege to discipline wives outlined in the Personal Status Code. Article 53 of the penal code states that there shall be no crime if the act takes place in good faith in the use of a lawful right and within the limit of such a right. The following are considered cases for the use of a right. Number 1, punishment by a husband of his wife, and punishment by parents and custodians of minor children within the limits prescribed by Sharia or Islamic law. So while the Personal Status Code creates an ethical space for a responsible husband to discipline his wife, even physically if necessary, the Penal Code protects this disciplinary right within the limits of that which is specified by the Sharia or the law. What is meant by the limits of the Sharia or by law is left vague in Article 56. So the limit on punishment is open to interpretation. It is problematic enough that husbands have disciplinary privileges over wives and that the right to hit wives is protected. But the vague limits on husbandly discipline leaves women further vulnerable to domestic violence. This raises a host of questions, including, number 1, whether the law in the UAE actually permits husbands to hit their wives, and number 2, if so, what separates legitimate hitting from unacceptable hitting? And number 3, what are the limits of the Sharia that the article states? Here it is useful to consider a 2010 domestic violence case that was brought before a judge in the UAE. In this case, a man was brought to court by his wife and daughter, both of whom had sustained injuries as a result of having been beaten by him. The man defended himself, claiming that he was permitted to hit his wife and daughter according to the Sharia. Chief Justice Falah al-Hajri, who ruled in this case, ceded that the Sharia did not allow husbands to hit their wives. That it did allow husbands to hit their wives. However, he argued that this permission was restricted. He is quoted as saying, quote, although the law permits the husband to use his right to discipline, he has to abide by the limits of this right. If the husband abuses this right to discipline, he cannot be exempted from punishment. So for this Chief Justice, the restriction on hitting was connected to physical traces of violence on women's bodies. He argued that husbands could not hit their wives and children so hard as to leave bruises or cuts. And so he fined the man the equivalent of 85 pounds for beating his wife and daughter. This negligible fine reflects the legislative limits to prosecuting domestic violence in the UAE. At the moment, domestic violence, despite vague restrictions, is effectively a protected husbandly right. So a narrow interpretation of Quran 434 plays a key role in religious arguments used by the UAE to support a patriarchal marital structure and to defend the right of husbands to physically discipline their wives. Quran 434, which was also the primary source text used by pre-colonial jurists to justify the right of husbands to hit their wives for disciplinary purposes, This verse has been described by Professor Ziba Mir Hosseini as the DNA of patriarchy in Islamic law, and extensive research bears out this claim. The pre-modern interpretation of 434 is relatively uniform, and it reads, and we're going to be working with this text for a few minutes, so I'm going to leave it up. Men are in authority, or qawamun, over women because God has preferred some over others and because they spend of their wealth. Righteous women are obedient and guard in their husband's absence what God would have them guard. Concerning those women from whom you fear disobedience or rebellion, nushuz, admonish them and or abandon them in bed and or wadribuhunna, hit them. If they obey you, do not seek a means against them. God is most high, great. I describe the above translation as a pre-modern interpretation of this verse because all translations are acts of interpretation. Furthermore, Arabic words, like other Semitic languages, are inherently polyvalent, lending themselves to multiple shades of meaning. Most all Arabic words are derived from three-letter roots and acquire numerous meanings along the way. The standard pre-modern interpretation of this verse was informed by an idealized cosmology held by pre-modern scholars who all lived in patriarchal social and historical contexts in which men were ontologically superior to women. Men were believed to be smarter and stronger. Their privileged social and ontological status was reflected in rights and privileges in the legal system that empowered men over women. Men's inherent superiority granted them authority over their wives. By extension, good wives demonstrated their obedience to God and his cosmic order by being obedient to their husbands. When husbands were absent, wives were expected to guard their husbands' belongings, which included access to their vulvas. Husbands were responsible for keeping their wives within this cosmic order, and when wives were disobedient, husbands were responsible for disciplining them through verbal admonishment, abandonment, and physical discipline. The scope and extent of all of these terms, disobedience, admonishment, abandonment, and hitting, were debated among pre-modern Muslim scholars. Disobedience could include a wife's refusal to fulfill her religious obligations of fasting or praying, or it could include any alteration of her behavior from the desirable to the undesirable, such as her no longer standing when her husband entered a room, or no longer rejoicing at his touch. These were actual examples that were given. Disobedience could include a sharp tongue or sexual refusal. In response to disobedience, admonishment could be verbal reasoning or harsh and abusive speech. The second response to disobedience, abandonment in bed, wahjuruhunna fil madaja, could be sexual withdrawal in bed, emotional withdrawal of intimacy, forcing a wife to have sex only when the husband wanted it and not when she wanted it, marital rape, tying her in bed and forcing her to have sex against her will, or most interestingly, calling her to bed, which is the opposite of all of the other ones. Jurists debated which of these reflected the divine intent. The third response to disobedience, hitting, was uniformly understood as physical discipline, but the range of permissible hitting was debated by Muslim scholars. Most agreed that husbands should hit their wives in a non-extreme or ghair mubarrih manner, but some considered non-extreme hitting to include punching and kicking. Others thought that hitting with a stick or a whip were non-extreme. Some specified extreme hitting as whipping a wife more than 79 times, and still others thought it was most honorable for a husband to abstain from hitting his wife in all circumstances, even though this was a God-given right. As can be seen, there was considerable room for debate about the meanings of key terms, some of which were interpreted in opposing ways. Nevertheless, all of these interpretations assume that husbands have disciplinary privileges over their wives, and that the privilege is a direct result of men's superiority over women. So in the modern period, an egalitarian idealized cosmology has emerged, in which men and women stand on equal footing before God. Neither is superior to the other, nor does one gender enjoy privileges at the expense of the other. God has created all humans as equal to one another, without distinguishing and discriminating against any gender, race, class, sex. In this new way of understanding God and her creation, there is little room for God's words to support a patriarchal normative message. In fact, granting husbands moral oversight over their wives makes shadow deities of the husbands, which compromises and violates the core principle of Islam, which is radical monotheism and, verges on shirk. So what do Muslim scholars do with an egalitarian idealized cosmology? What do they do with Quran 434? They offer egalitarian interpretations of this verse, and given the potential for multivalence in the Arabic language reflected in the multiple pre-modern interpretations that we just encountered, it is rather simple to argue for a new interpretation's potential validity. The first phrase, for example, previously read as men are in authority over women, is now read as men are the breadwinners for women. And rather than a prescriptive statement, this line is understood as descriptive of social conditions in 7th century Arabia, into which the Quran was revealed. In that society, men were the primary breadwinners, but this is not a normative statement about how things should be. Rather, this verse simply describes how things were. Furthermore, the some that are preferred by God over others does not necessarily mean that God preferred men over women, but rather some people over other people. Moving to the second half of the verse, Quran 434 is now seen as offering couples with a constructive way to deal with marital conflict. When a couple finds themselves in conflict, they should first engage in mutual consultation. If the problem persists, they should try separation. If this fails to resolve the problem, they should walk away from each other. But if the separation brings them together, they should have sex. The verb daraba, which was uniformly interpreted to mean hit them in the pre-modern period, can linguistically also be interpreted to mean walk away from them or have sex with them. As seen from the pre-modern interpretations of abandonment, wahjuruhunna fil madaja, as ranging in meaning from sexual abandonment to marital rape to calling one's wife to bed, Muslim scholars have always been comfortable interpreting the Quran in the most expansive way possible. Therefore, to think of wadribuhunna in an expansive light is in line with the methodology of pre-modern scholars. This alternative interpretation of 434, which is offered by modern Muslim scholars, illustrates that Quran 434 can be compellingly read in completely opposite ways, depending on the idealized cosmology one brings to the text. This fact highlights the truth that religious communities determine the meanings of sacred texts. That gives believing communities a great deal of agency in interpreting divine texts, coupled with the fact that they can be held responsible for the interpretations to which they choose to adhere. Simplistic appeals of adherence to Sharia or Islamic law to justify and defend the choice to adhere to a patriarchal interpretation of Islam are disingenuous because there is no singular position in the Sharia or Islamic law on any given issue, and no one way to read sacred text. Given the UAE's appeal to religious law in expressing reservations to CEDAW and the use of religious language in Article 56 of the Personal Status Code and Article 53 of the Penal Code, it appears that religious reasoning is a central obstacle to eliminating discrimination against women and criminalizing domestic violence in the UAE. However, as seen above, religious reasoning is highly malleable and has already been used to promote a gender-equal family structure that does not sanction violence against women at the hands of husbands. Yet, the practical obstacle that the UAE may face in choosing to adhere to a gender-equal interpretation of Islamic law and embracing an egalitarian idealized cosmology is that of precedent. Specifically, religious traditions, and Islam is no exception to this, tend to root their authority in an ancient tradition that provides continuity in the face of decaying values. Thus, new interpretations should ideally find some precedent in historical opinions. The problem is that since a pre-modern Islamic tradition was entirely and unsurprisingly patriarchal, a gender-equal position will never be found in the pre-modern tradition. Does this mean that it is impossible for Islamic law to treat the genders equally? Will Islamic law always discriminate against women? Will it fail to achieve gender justice because it developed in a patriarchal social and historical context? Although it is a tall order to break from the pre-modern Islamic tradition, the fact is that Muslims have a tradition of breaking from their own tradition. After all, traditions must necessarily change in order to remain relevant to changing historical and social circumstances. However, even while it changes, the tradition must also impart a sense of continuity and unchangingness, so that believers can feel that they belong to something greater than themselves. One strategy for changing tradition while appearing continuous is to focus on methodology over content. In embracing a gender egalitarian interpretation of Quran 434, Muslim scholars would be holding fast to the Islamic tradition's methodology of considering a wide range of interpretive possibilities for terms and verses. Within this methodology, multiple readings and definitions for key terms should be considered when determining law. Indeed, the UAE itself has demonstrated such a flexible methodology. For instance, the minimum age of marriage in pre-modern Islamic law is 6 to 9 years old. But the UAE has broken from this tradition to set the minimum marriage age at 18 years of age. In this case, The specific law was reinterpreted to be contextually contingent and historically bound. Similarly, though classical Islamic law unanimously awards child custody in the case of divorce to men, the UAE has reformed its law to put the child's interest first in determining the custody of children. These developments are heartening and suggest that there is space in the UAE's legal structure to develop a gender-equal family law, where men and women are treated as equal parties in marriage. This commitment to gender equality will allow the UAE to fully ratify CEDAW, become a member of the global community in treating women and men as equal parties in marriage, and become a leader of Muslim-majority countries in promoting gender-equal family laws. In doing so, the UAE will have a strong legal, moral, and religious foundation to criminalize all forms of domestic violence categorically. So the three major policy recommendations of this paper are to use religious language and justification that will allow the UAE to, 1, fully ratify CEDAW, removing all reservations that instantiate a patriarchal marital structure. 2, criminalize all forms of domestic violence by instituting hefty penalties for domestic violence and adopting a zero-tolerance policy on all forms of domestic violence. And finally, number 3, invest in enforcement of such penalties so they are a deterrent for domestic violence while also building infrastructure for protecting women from abuse. Thank you.
These work. I don't know who we talk to. Before I open the floor for questions and answers, I was flown here to give a few comments, so I feel obliged. Since this is a conference about the evolving roles of women in the Arab world, and the panel, looking at this panel in Islamic laws and vis-a-vis gender equity, I think the three papers have few themes that emerge. Number one is that Islamic law is dynamic, subject to interpretation and sometimes manipulation by social and political agents. Number two, Islamic law is not inherently anti-gender equity. It's not against women, as we saw in Amira's paper and also in Aisha's paper. But like all legal documents and doctrines, it is flexible, better applied when understood broadly rather than very narrowly, and varies between theory and practice. Amira's paper also talks about how the scholars, the elite, saw the ideal conditions and how lived realities were very far from the elite's thoughts. A third theme that emerges that also helped me understand gender equity in the Islamic context, and the work of Val and Munira Sharad also contextualized that for me as well, and emerges in these papers, is that the problem with the Islamic law as it is implemented currently is faulty modern interpretations, and that are further complicated by social and political factors. Val talks about, in your previous work, you talk about how Islam should be understood as a political movement and as a political agents rather than a total explanation of how to understand the Middle East and women's rights there. Sharad introduces another variable of kinship that is used by Gail in her paper, tribalism and kinship solidarities that are essential to understanding maybe the uniqueness of the Arab and Islamic society. The other theme that emerges here is that women are not taking the faulty modern interpretation at face value. So the evolving role of women in the Arab world is to reinterpret, engage in reinterpreting and re-understanding and applying or adopting their own understanding of Islamic law. The fourth theme that emerges from this paper is that through the cases of UAE, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan, Palestinian, historically for a while, we see that the evolving roles of women are to now demand or fight for equal citizenship status, not a citizenship that is mediated through the family or understood through modern application of 7th century explanation of Islam. So while the world and the rest of society has picked up with the 21st century, the women are saying the 7th century is no longer good for us. We need to evolve as well. And fifth, and I'll stop after a while, we see that international resources, whether these are organization, conventions, I see that the United Nations is not yet eager to come and say this is a resolution. It's just a convention, CEDAW, and really no enforcing mechanism in that. And this ambiguity about international commitment to women's rights has, inspired and empowered women within an Islamic context, but has brought onto them a lot of criticism, exclusion, and disempowerment as well. So the evolving role of women in the Arab world today is to introduce exogenous values and standards into the within an Islamic framework in a manner that does not disturb the tribal values, the kinship values. Future research might help us look at issues that you guys also brought up more indirectly, and that is the diversity, ethnic, sectarian, and class diversity, and how Islamic law applies or deals with those. I have questions for you, so because I'm the moderator, I get to go first, but then I'll open it up for others. Gil, I'm going to start with you. And I was very curious about the variable that you took that for people viewing government, you knew I was gonna ask, should take responsibility of the people. If I understand Sharad's framework, I would say that she would argue the opposite, because her understanding of kinship solidarities as competing with national solidarities and being more indigenous to the society. Are you trying to say that today the society has transposed those kinship solidarity to apply them to national, the country, the state? Because I would assume that it would be the exact opposite. But this is just my simplistic understanding. And I guess with Sandra's paper, and you don't have to answer it, Ariana. Yes, I do understand that women back in the medieval time, back in the time frame that she was talking about, there were women who were involved in economic activities, but the seclusion of women was prevalent, and that cannot be underscored. And I think she needs to address that in some way. And Aisha, I was shocked I love the reinterpretation and rereading of the Quranic verses. Please, any men in the room, do not take on the idea that husbands are shadow deities. This is not accepted, but the interpretation of wadrubuhunna to mean walk away or have sex, and how you derive to that from the root of the word. I'm assuming, walk away probably is a D, not a DH, not a dot. So if you can just explain to us those. No, sure. Do you want to? Yes.
So the government responsibility, I've kind of gave up on as a good measure, partly for that concern. I mean, my original thinking was that, and we should probably ask Munira what she would say, but is that the government did take on a very patrimonial role across the Middle East and North Africa in terms, and it did shift the role of the family in terms of bringing up children and so on, right? Offering jobs and economic security moved from the king group to the government in the post-independent period. As I mentioned before, I've taken this variable out, and a number of the most important findings do not change. And as you saw with the original regression models, it doesn't have a strong substantive impact. My my hesitation or my criticism of this variable now is not necessarily of the Sherrard interpretation as much as I think it's probably more a function of people, of neoliberal economic reforms and how people are responding to that. So in that sense, I think it's not a great measure. I would like ideally to have some other survey questions that measure, ideas of authority versus the individual that would better capture it. But this, I really think it's people. I looked at changes across the two waves, and there's actually a huge increase in the number of people saying that the government should take more responsibility between the early 2000s and 2007 and 2008. And I think that's likely a function of economics and the national level economic policies of Morocco and Jordan at that time. So I don't think it's actually a measure that's capturing what I wanted to capture anymore, so I've kind of disregarded it. Because of that. So yeah, so I mean, I agree that it's not a great measure, but for different reasons, and I think it's not capturing what I had originally intended it to capture.
Just to comment briefly on that, like I said, this is not my paper, so just postulating. I would say the seclusion definitely is something that she should address here in this paper, and I think your point in your summary about focusing on class differences is something that could greatly improve her discussion of women working, because she gives a very colorful description of all of these different jobs that women had, but we don't really get a sense of who these women were, their place in society. So I think she could definitely, I'll send that comment along to her for the edits to go a little deeper. Who were these women? Where were they in society? Were these lower class women or upper class women? So absolutely I agree with you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll respond to that question, and then I have a question for Gail as well. So just like verbalizing everything. Okay. So in terms of there's two issues with daraba, right? So daraba, various conjugations of it can have up to at least 50 meanings, right? So it can mean things from taking a walk, walking in the earth. Like the Quran actually talks about daraba in these various conjugations. It talks about fadribu fil ard, right? Like go out into the earth and see my signs or whatever. And then so there's many ways, and it can mean to wear a hijab, to apply a poll tax, to pitch a tent. I mean, there's all the conjugations of daraba, right? So, but you're right that linguistically you would have to add like a preposition after it, or you would have to add something to make it literally mean something other than hit them. However, I think that the case, like the situation with the term abandon them in bed, wahjuruhunna fil madaji, is a really good example for why Muslim scholars have always used various hermeneutical strategies, interpretive strategies, to translate or interpret or find the meaning of a derived meaning from the Quran, and that these strategies are not limited only to linguistic ones. So, for example, they will, for example, offer meanings for words that are often the opposite of the plain sense meaning of that verse, because you're using, for example, a methodology of interpreting the Quran through other verses in the Quran, or if they think that a meaning would just no longer make sense according to their theology at the time. So they do that with many different verses. But interestingly, they do it with wahjuruhunna fil madaji as well, right? Because they, like Abdul Razak As-Sanani says, abandon them in bed is what it literally means, or ostracize them in bed, and he says it means call them to bed, which is the opposite of what it means. And nobody ever challenged him on that because it wasn't honest philologically. So what I'm arguing is you're not restricted actually by the grammar of that word. Muslims are not, and they have it. And Laleh Bakhtiar, in her recent translation of the Quran, interprets this as walk away. She doesn't interpret it as hit them at all. And
It's interpreted in the Iranian civil code.
Yeah, excellent.
And just on the point of the Iran, I think it's Asif Bayat's, his like everyday feminism. There's an example of it was a women's magazine in Iran that they had published some reinterpretations of this exact verse.
Yeah, and Musawa also
Works like, Ziba Mir Husseini.
Two words you were
exactly.
talking about, and so you could maybe
Yeah.
draw on those
Yeah.
two different interpretations.
Right.
I don't think they use
that too, honestly.
Yeah, sorry?
It was
I
something
think
else.
Mahmoud talks about that as well.
I don't think she talks necessarily about this verse. I haven't read anything about it, but I talk about like all of these interpretations in my book. In like chapter 4 of my book, I talk about all the various modern interpretations of it. But absolutely. But my question for you is, you sort of said it at the end, Gail. And when you were ending, You said it really quickly, and I wanted you to just talk about it a little bit more. You said that you didn't find that religion had any sort of influence in the answers that you were getting. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you know that, and what sorts of questions you asked about religion that made you think that drew, like, made you come to that conclusion?
Okay, so this is a difficult question. So one, I didn't ask any of these questions. This is the World Values Survey, so I'm kind of working in limited data. But generally, with the World Values Survey or any other cross-national surveys, the measures for religiosity are pretty standard, right? How important is religion in your life? How important is God in your life? How many times a week do you pray, or how many times a day do you pray? How often do you to go to mosque or church or something like that? So these are the kind of battery of questions that you can get. Now, within the Middle East and North Africa, there's a huge amount of missing data and non-response for some of these questions. Right? Within the kind of Norris Inglehart type questions and this larger literature on Muslim majority countries, the two main questions are how important is God in your life, and how important is religion in your life, right? For those kind of capturing levels of religiosity. Now, there's a couple of issues involved in those measures. One, in terms of how I refine it, it just doesn't show up as a significant coefficient in the regression analysis, right? They don't have a statistically significant effect on this. And I talk about this in the paper that it's problematic to interpret this too much, because there's simply, within the Middle East and North Africa, there's, for a variety of reasons we could talk about, social desirability, framing issues, and things like that, very little variation, right? So you're talking about upwards of 92% of the people are responding religion is very important in my life, and God is very important in my life. So these are not very good questions. These particular surveys, the World Value Surveys, right, with some of the more nuanced questions about praying and stuff like that, you just have too many missing values to use. The other issue is that it's not to suggest that religion is not important, as you talk about, and in the case of Morocco and Egypt, right? That Islam, right, the reform movements, and particularly the king, phrased the reform in terms of Islamic language. Like, this was consistent. So it's not saying that religion is not important in the reforms or in people's life, but that it's not a barrier to kind of gender equality or attitudes towards gender equality. Because most certainly, if you look at how the reforms were passed, and there's one article about why Jordan was unsuccessful but Morocco won. It was successful in reforms. Part of it had to do with how they couched it, right, in terms of being consistent with Islamic law versus being, liberal, Western, democratic reform. So it's not to say that religion is unimportant. It's just that, religiosity, and particularly being a Muslim, a very religious Muslim, doesn't affect gender equality. So it's a complex question, but it's talked about a lot in the paper.
Thank you. We'll start.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Gale. I found it really interesting that you found in Egypt there was greater conservatism in regards to women. Okay,
Is that surprising?
No, but I have a couple questions around that. It's not surprising. I found the same in the UAE, actually.
Yeah.
And what is interesting too, this is why I also want to ask, where did you interview, how many people you interviewed? I found that in certain parts of the UAE there was this trend, and then in other parts and institutions especially there was the opposite trend, and that is the case in Qatar as well. So who did you interview, which institutions, and perhaps what policy recommendations you might have in that regard?
So I didn't do these surveys, these are from the World Value Survey.
Oh,
So these are the national representative, more or less national representative, and the regressions were weighted for the sampling stratification methodology they use. So this was not me. I ideally, inshallah, someone will give me money to conduct my own survey. Because of issues of religiosity and some of these other questions, there's now more with the development of better survey techniques to get at some of these issues of social desirability and response bias, things like that. So that's this was just individuals over the age of 18. for that. No, I think it's understandable that we would see this in a number of countries, Jordan, Egypt, given the period of we're talking about between 2001 and 2007 and 2008. So did I answer your question? I think I have one more.
I was wondering where the research took place, so which institutions, maybe you don't.
Oh, so this was just, it wasn't institutional, it was individuals, so they stratified
So in
by.
Cairo mostly, or?
No, so in Egypt it's national representatives, so they it's a stratified system, so they do by, regions, and then they sample within those things. So it's basically households, and they'll kind of interview that. In terms, so it's not institutional level, it's not, it's done, a public opinion survey in the US would be done. I just do want to bring this up. So kind of trying to understand, and this is a really interesting finding.
Yeah, I also just,
Oh, here we go. Is, I just have my appendix here. And I kind of looked at some of the kin-based values, not the government one. And I'll just show you kind of my preliminary attempts to understand this. So we can see that you've actually had it within Egypt, an increase in these, the number of people disapproving of females as single parents, increase in number of people saying housewives fulfilling, no change. But even compared to Egypt, look at the percentage of the respondents saying that, a family, a child needs a mother and father, right? Things. And also you had a statistically increase in the number of people saying obedience was an important child pop. Versus Morocco, where you see almost a decrease and you see a decrease almost across the board with those respondents, and even there was no change with the obedience, but it's roughly around 50%, which is lower than both ways in the for Egypt. So you can kind of see that maybe part of this is being explained by the change in these values and among individuals, not at the institutional level.
How about if we take 3 questions at a time for the sake of saving time, and then I'm going to ask the speakers to just take 2 minutes to answer each question. So we'll go ma'am in the back, and then sir, and then go ahead.
Thank you to all our speakers for some very interesting and informative presentations. My question is, has anyone looked into the role of the non-Muslim Arab women in their world, of which we know there are significant minorities depending on where you're looking, but specifically in the Levant? And I must say I didn't hear as much information about the Levant, Syria. We know they're striving just to stay alive, but I was curious about if there's been any research in Syria, Palestinian women under occupation, Lebanese women, of course, a special category. But how about starting with the role of non-Muslim Arab women and how the two interact? To whomever.
Yes, my question, I don't know anything about the judiciary, or when Dr. Chaudhry, when you say reinterpret or interpret, is the function that you're describing of interpretation done strictly in the religious realm, or is it in a civil realm? Does the civil realm have the power to reinterpret Sharia? Does it differ among the various countries that we're talking about?
Yeah, my question in a sense perhaps is related to that, the last question, so it's a question for Aisha. And it's really about the links between textual interpretations and social change. So you talked about how there are some of these new interpretations and these examples where words are being used to mean the opposite, almost suggesting a kind of unlimited flexibility. And so it's a question of, to what extent do those interpretations have resonance across society, beyond perhaps more elite circles. And then I'm just thinking in particular about the situation of domestic violence. So, for example, I'm aware of research on one study with Palestinian women, I think in West Bank and Gaza, and it was a survey on their experiences and perceptions of domestic violence. And whilst, of course, they expressed that they hated it and it was awful, amazingly, I think it was something like almost 70% accepted that it was okay. I mean, it was justifiable. And so I think also, there's also a discourse, and so here there's a kind of social class aspect, I think, going on. And so I think, also anecdotally, when I talk to women in Lebanon from different kinds of backgrounds, I get the same sort of sense. And there's a fear sometimes when you discuss or you want to discuss things that are about Sharia or Islamic interpretation, people clam up because there's a fear of being labelled as outside of the religion or as kafir in some kind of way. And so I guess I'm just sort of trying to think in terms of, societal change. And, on the one hand, of course, it's important to have laws, and that's an important way to change things. But, I mean, there's also examples of, for example, when laws were changed about women's representation in the Gulf, and so women were allowed to run for office, but nothing really came of it because it was a very kind of top-down kind of change. Whereas if you compare with Egypt and with women's movements in Egypt, the same kind of thing in the 50s and 60s, there was success. So I'm sorry that's kind of very broad, muddled.
No, that's great. So I'll try to answer it in 2 minutes. Well, why don't you combine the two questions and then you get 4 minutes? Okay, great. Thank you. So those two questions are very related.
So first of all, I mean, I think the keynote the speech was so perfect for framing this conversation because there are all these endogenous and exogenous factors that need to be taken into consideration. And I guess I'm coming from a religious studies perspective. So I'm specifically coming from how does religion inform these policies? How does religion affect society and people's perceptions of these ideas? And I really strongly believe that not only, that the things that are preached at the sermon, like on Fridays at the pulpit, very deeply inform people's attitudes towards specific issues. And I have been to sermons where where the subject has been, what are the reasons for which you can hit your wife? Or I have been in situations where women have asked in mosques, my husband beats me, is there a verse that says that he can, and will I be sinning if I call the police on him, right? So there is a connection between, what people are taught in religious settings about the appropriate relationship between husbands and wives and the kinds of practice that they do. It's not the only thing. There's of course, to alleviate this, in many ways, education is a really important response to that. There's many other things that a society can do. But from a religious perspective, religion is important not just because religious beliefs, like what is preached at the pulpit, deeply influences how people understand the world, but and this is going back to the earlier question, in countries where the religious clerics have strong power, religious discourse shapes laws and policy. And a good example of this is Yemen. In Yemen, they had a law instituting under the minimum marriage age for 17 or 18. And then it was repealed because the religious scholars made a huge stink about the fact that they felt like this law insulted the Prophet, who had married his youngest wife when she was 9. And so there was a strong religious debate that happened in Yemen with religious scholars on both sides arguing for a minimum marriage age and against minimum marriage age. And it was an intra-religious conversation. And it was, of course, there are so many economic, social, political factors for why marriage of minors happens in many countries. But religious discourse is an important part of that puzzle. And so I guess I'm coming at it specifically from that perspective. So I think I'll just say that for now. But it's a longer conversation. It's a very good question.
Do you want to answer, all of you, the question on non-Muslim women that you encountered?
I have to have a quick comment about that. Just to let you know, later on in the day, there will be a paper about Syrian and Syrian-Palestinian women, so you'd be interested in hearing that. But just a quick little fact from Amira's paper that I didn't include in my speech was that previously some Christian women would go to Islamic courts to get a divorce in case they were rejected from getting a divorce in their own churches. So that's just an interesting fact that I thought you would.
Without having to convert, because currently they have to convert.
Right.
But the men would have to convert it.
As well, yes.
That's true.
Anybody? Well, I've done research on Lebanese women, both Muslim and Christians, and I would be happy to talk to you afterward. I found that the most conservative non-Muslims are the Catholic in Lebanon. They are more conservative than the Shia, and the most advanced and modern are the Orthodox Christian and the Sunnis on many levels when it comes to personal status law. Be happy to talk. This is outside. But let's take 3 more questions. Yes.
Yes. So one comment for Gail. Gail, have you tried using factor analysis to actually figure out what's going on? I know this is a technical comment, but in terms of figuring out the relationship between some of the survey questions that you're looking at to get at kin group, and more importantly, I think you're already operationalizing for it as well as you can with the World Values Survey if you take out that question on state. But I'm curious about your religiosity variable, and I think factor analysis might actually help there. Are you using like one question, or are you actually creating an index of multiple questions to capture religiosity? So I'd be curious to see like which questions you're using for that. My question is for Dr. Chaudhry as well, Aisha. So I think again, very interesting paper. I remember you said again part of I believe it was Article 16 said that again, women were actually allowed to, for instance, if there was an issue of domestic violence, if there was actually some way for them to showcase they had been harmed, then their cases, when it came to divorce, would actually be put into court, correct? So I was curious about how, and again, there's also the insofar quote about, Islamic law. So I was curious how laws about women serving as witnesses actually affect that ultimately, and what your knowledge is about that maybe across the board in general, because again, whenever somebody's invoking Sharia, if somebody's invoking Sharia law, then that kind of comes into play in these kinds of disputes.
Okay, so I have a question. It seems like things are getting worse in Egypt, and that in Gail's paper she talked about the negative attitudes from housewives, unemployed, and self-employed. So these are people who are largely isolated or mixed with peers and not a diverse group of people. And yet, 35% now of households in Egypt are led by women. So what's going on?
They're being divorced.
Anyone else?
They're being divorced.
Yes.
Yes, I had a question for Aisha. Are these new interpretations that you present being championed by actual Emiratis? And like the judge you mentioned, would he be someone you consider like a feminist activist judge? Or, is that common? Is he an exception? And I'm not sure about the UAE is allowing women to become judges, but I know this is kind of coming up in some other Gulf countries that women are allowed to be public prosecutors, potentially in 20 years be able to apply to be judges. So do you think that might change some of these interpretations? And then for Gail, a quick question about the divorcees. You said had more liberal attitudes towards gender. So did you separate out male divorcees and female divorcees? I was just curious to know a little bit about that demographic since I'm looking at them for a paper of mine. So I don't know if you said gender, so obviously females have.
It wasn't separated out.
Okay. Well, I'd be curious to see that. Maybe if you could.
Gender is included as a variable, but I didn't separate out just male divorcees.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'd be curious to know because our male divorcees all of a sudden through their negative experience with their marriage feminists or or would they be more patriarchal? I'd be kind of curious.
The women aspect of things, if you're divorced, you would
probably be more aware of the gender inequality for a divorced woman.
So why don't you do an answer? Yeah, the question.
Okay, so that one, yes, no, I haven't done it, but I think that's a good idea. The factor analysis, methodologically, I go back and forth on this. I think you're right at least to do it as a preliminary step to check how well the kin-based values fit together. In terms of the dependent variables, I actually think it's better to leave them separate. I know a lot of previous research does combine them into indices, but as you can see, right, that things aren't affecting all of these the same way. And we shouldn't theoretically expect, them to, the different variables to affect attitudes about women in politics versus economics versus university education, especially in some countries, right, where a university education, like in the case of Jordan, right, education, you know, even at higher levels is important for both male and female, right? And so I think I don't want to include them in a combined index. I mean, it's worth as a robustness check to compare to other things. But I think for the kin-based value, that it's worth looking at how much the percentage of variation.
Well, more interesting to me is like the religiosity variable.
Oh,
because
yeah, so
gonna
that, the
be-
other point of your thing is, I left them separate and I used to the importance of religion in your life and the importance of God in your life, and I left them separate. As I mentioned before, the issue of non-response left out a lot of the other ones, which I could have potentially combined. Again, it's worth at least checking a combined index of religiosity, like, you know, some of the attendance and
Or seeing what else will load on it. I mean, that's the thing, when we've done similar surveys, we're surprised to see what actually loads on a, you know, religiosity factor. It's not always the typical survey question, so you might find something else loading on it that could actually have a significant impact.
And we also
so I mean, that's worth checking.
And we also know very well
to get around
in the Middle East that people always overestimate. We know this very well, and we know that there's social desirability in the Middle East, especially when you're asking them, how many times do you pray? Every day. 3 times.
Yeah, so
Five
that,
times.
I mean,
Yeah, we know very well in the Middle East. But I don't really use much of the religious questions in the work-based surveys because I know that unless you're going to, as Zena was saying, you're going to create an index or something out of them and kind of factor analysis and alpha and see what's the relationship actually how it's going. Because I personally don't believe that people accurately state their level of piety in the Middle East when it comes to survey questions.
yeah, and I think this is a general issue, and like some of the newer techniques that are being used in the region, like list experiments, some of the other kind of priming survey experiments are probably a better way to get at religiosity. Given what we have, it is probably worth looking at some other less direct questions of religiosity and at least seeing how well, because you're right, because I mean, if you spend any time in the Middle East, right, you know that like 95% of the people are not equally religious. You know, but then like, you know, as on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is God in your life? You know, 95% of people are saying 10. Okay, that's not a measure that is accurate, but you know, it's what we know.
You had the question on negative attitudes of housewives.
Yeah, just like, is the economic independence of the growing economic independence of women in Egypt, 35% of households, maybe somebody, it wasn't your paper, it was another paper, and then juxtaposed with your findings that these attitudes towards gender equity had really worsened amongst housewives, unemployed, and self-employed. And so I just thought this is interesting.
I think that was in my presentation, yeah.
So it's not a specific question about what's in your paper, it's just like, what do you think as women are becoming, is this a whiplash? I mean, what is going on if more women are leading households in Egypt and yet society seems to be coming down harder on gender equity? How is this happening? How are they getting divorced, or are they single households because they're it's just, maybe you can't answer it, but it's an interesting fact.
Yeah, it's something interesting to think about in terms of, it could be, you know, that they are getting divorced, I think is one issue. And, you know, actually that, you know, of the divorced people, that they actually have more positives towards gender equality, so it's not necessarily related to the housewife. You know, I think the idea with the housewives and the unemployed is that, you know, these series of needs of,
Iman Bibbers has done a lot of work on this. Iman Bibbers?
Oh, yes, yeah. Just to add to that, though, there is a connection, of course, between, you know, this growing rate of female-headed households and, of course, Islamic law and the state, because current interpretations of Islamic law, of course, provide for the mahar. And yet for low-income households, the mahar is absolutely insignificant. And so many of these female-headed households are actually impoverished in Egypt. So there is a need to, you know, to change the law, but also for the state to step in in terms of social provisioning and some support structures for these women so that they can get back into the workforce as well. But so it's a serious problem in Egypt, and Imam and others have written about this.
I think in Kuwait they also have changed the law for giving single
or a female-headed household some kind of a social security benefits just recently.
Yeah, loans for
Loans, yeah, for housing.
on their own without a male guardian now.
I wanted to raise the question. This panel.
Can we answer the questions?
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
saving you for
Sorry.
the end. But she's got 3 questions.
I'm going to be really quick. I think I have 2 questions.
2 questions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
Inflated.
no, it's good. You're keeping tabs. So in terms of the witnessing question, the whole witnessing conversation is actually a really fascinating one. So what's interesting, the reason that I spent some time talking about classical Islamic law and the way that this verse was instituted legally, the reason that I spent time talking about that is because a lot of these countries, like the UAE, are like saying that they're committed to classical Islamic law. And an article in the Personal Status Code, they actually like lift language that is like from the classical Islamic legal works into the Personal Status Code. So it's like it's not irrelevant. Like what was being said in the medieval period is very much relevant. And so given that, the way that they understand injury, like a demonstrable harm, is that you come with bruises, like broken bones or bruises or cuts, like something that you can show evidence that I have been hit, or like I have, like now here's a sign for what happened. The question of witnesses is a whole separate one that is really fascinating. So there's the idea that the witness of 2 women is equal to 1 man in like economic cases, for example, but like not necessarily in family-related cases. And then but then it gets creepy because it's like this idea of I was just reading about recently. I'm writing this paper on this topic about what happens when you accuse someone of adultery or fornication, which is the same thing, zina, right? The procedure is that you have to bring 4 witnesses to 4 male witnesses have to come forward and say this has happened. But what happens if a couple is brought before the court? And so this is a theoretical question they're asking. What happens when a couple is brought before the court and they're accused of adultery, and a girl is accused of adultery, and 4 witnesses come forward and they bear witness, but it turns out she's a virgin. So she says, I'm a virgin. So what happens? Like, what do you do? Well, you get these virginity checkers, these women to come in, and you check their virginity. So this is an unofficial way of women to be witnesses. And if they verify, and then they don't talk about how you check for virginity, but if they verify that she is a virgin, and if you just imagine that little space that they don't think about, there's like so much going on there. But if it turns out that they say she's a virgin, so what happens to the guys who were the male witnesses? Well, in Islamic law, if you bear a false witness, you're supposed to be whipped 80 times, right? So the punishment for zina is 100 lashes, but if for false slander, for false testimony, it's 80. But in this case, they're like, the men go free because the virginity checkers were women. So it's like this complicated way in which gender affects witnessing. That's really interesting. So on the one hand, they have real power. On the other hand, they don't. Their power is very restricted.
The question would be how many of these cases actually wind up going into court on the women's side? If it's that complicated?
I don't know. I'm just getting into. I've spent most of my the last 10 years working on text. So now I'm moving into other stuff. Yeah.
And your next question?
Oh, and the other question was about Emirati judges. So that's a really great question, and I don't know how he would feel. But I feel like the conversation about it's 2 things. One is that in Islamic law you can have female judges. So you can. So technically that should be an easy one to overcome, which makes you realize there's all these other things going on in addition to religion for why there are not women judges. Right. And then the other thing is that the new interpretations that are being offered are mostly being offered by women men and women in the Western world. So they're usually people who are actually, some of the most interesting work is happening in Western universities by people who've been either exiles from their own home countries or they've been born and raised in North America or Europe. And those conversations deeply influence what's happening. The world is globalized, right? So, for example, a really quick example of this is Amina Wadud. In 2005, she leads a women-led prayer of both men and women in a church in New York City. And the next thing you know, Sheikh Ali Goma, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, is talking about it. He's disagreeing with it, but he's actually discussing this, where women had been talking about women-led prayer forever, and nobody had even, it was not even considered an acceptable topic of conversation. So even even if it's being ranted against, it's like her behavior changed the discourse around women's leadership. So.
Val, and we have a question in the back, but I'll let you.
Okay, something just occurred to me about the judges. I thought that under strict interpretations and classical interpretations of Islamic law, a woman could not be a judge, which is why the only countries in the Middle East and North Africa that have had judges are in the Maghreb, and because of the legacy of French,
they have them in Jordan and Bahrain too.
Well, more recently,
Yeah.
But there are positions in class. It's strange, but yeah, they're
Okay,
there.
I'd like to talk with you more about that later on, because the way it's also interpreted in Iran is precisely under classical interpretations. But this panel was so interesting to me, and I think to everybody. And one way that it's interesting is, I think, the different sort of causality that comes out in the papers. I think for Gail, it's, again, drawing on Munira's work on kin-based solidarities and structures. And I think in the other two papers, the real determinant is Islamic law, and it makes sense to a certain extent because the way in which the Arab heartland is different from the rest of the Islamic world, probably. The way the Islamic heartland is the Arab region, and there the law means so much. I mean, it's a very contractual sort of society and polity too. That's why we have these very elaborate marriage contracts, which you were talking about as well, where all sorts of stipulations have to be included in them and so on. So, and in my early work on female labor force participation back in the early 90s, I was also arguing this political economy argument about it's oil. It's the oil economy that suppresses female labor supply and demand for various reasons. But then later on, as in fact these economies were shifting, and some of them were no longer oil-based, but they had become more diversified. And meanwhile, I'm looking at some non-oil economies and realizing that there too the female labor force participation rate is very low. I started to look at Islamic family law. And it seemed to me that Islamic family law itself, with some of its provisions, actually does perpetuate this idea of the male breadwinner and the female homemaker, and it suppresses, again, female supply and demand for work. But of course, there are some other issues too, like the state not providing for paid maternity leave and childcare centers and so on. So it seems to me, Gail, that it may very well be more Islamic law than the kin-based patriarchies that are behind all of this. So that's just one, because in your paper you're really using the kin-based patriarchy as a determining factor. And yet, when you look at your two countries, in particular Egypt and Morocco, Morocco was the country that Munira had identified as being, kin-based and hence a very patriarchal family law. And yet, despite what my dear friends Fatima and Moha said, mentalities actually have been changing in Morocco, and your own data shows that very well, the data from the World Values Survey. So I'm not sure that I'm not at all convinced that kin-based structures, and I've talked with Munira about this, but I don't think that they're as salient, and I think I've talked with you, they're not as salient these days as they were for the period that she was writing about. But anyway, that's...
Well, and could they be proxying for religion? I mean, that's the other thing. Are all the questions that you're asking, are they actually religiosity questions? Are you getting at kin, or are you getting at this Islamic conservatism to the question?
Well, except when you look at kinship solidarity in other religions in the Middle East, and this which I did, and you'll see that Islam there is not a fact.
Here's another suggestion about the religiosity. Have you looked, Gil, at some of the other so-called more conservative cultures outside of the Middle East? So, for example, South Korea, Japan, Chile, United States. There might, on the question of religiosity. So, it might be interesting to see to what extent are we really talking about this Middle East exceptionalism when it comes to religion and such, and or there are actually some resonances elsewhere too, some similar patterns.
So we are running 12:05. Can we answer? We have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
Marwa, okay. So here and in the back, let me take the back first.
This question is for Dr. Chowdhury.
Can you speak up?
This is for Dr. Chowdhury. And I really like the fact that you mentioned that you have to take the religious arguments seriously and then challenge them on Islamic grounds. So on that note, have you read or have you used in your research the conflicting reports about the youngest wife of the Prophet's age being actually 19 and not 9, which they often use in the Sharia law to justify marrying children?
At 9.
Okay, thank you. And one more.
And one more question.
I just had a tiny comment when you were talking about what was the most important thing for education for children, and you said obedience rather than creativity. And I was thinking of conversations I hear between generations now, where grandparents my age are disagreeing with their children about the kind of restricted upbringing that ordinary middle-class American children are getting, and the idea that our emphasis on creativity in this generation was hippie bullshit, So I was thinking maybe some of these things are global and have to do with the way the world does seem so much more insecure now, perhaps.
Just to add to that, I know that there's research on what children are taught in the United States, white middle-class children versus minority poor children, and obedience is stressed among. Okay, one quick question.
Sure, and it actually has to do with somewhat what we've been saying right now. When you spoke about the minimum marriage age in Yemen being repealed, which actually surprised me because I didn't know it had been, because it was disrespectful to the Prophet, could that not actually have been, I was aware of that law causing problems with tribal values and with kin-based values. Could that repeal then have been actually using Islamic law or Islam, the dishonoring the Prophet as a cover-up for what really may have been those kin-based values?
That's a good
I don't know who that question goes to, which one of those.
Well, I just want to say, just in terms of the causality thing that you brought up, the causality issue, I think that I'm not disagreeing that patriarchal kin-shaped values are also influencing this. I'm not making the argument that religion is the only factor that we have to consider that's motivating these conversations. Absolutely, and as I said when I brought up that comment, that in Yemen there are a lot of other issues that were going on, especially economically, that were motivating people to marry their daughters off when they're minors that don't have to do with religion. But what I do think is important is that the religious language is the rhetoric that is used to make those cases. And I feel like we should take that seriously. We've sort of a lot of scholars have spent a lot of time saying, they're saying it's religion, but it's actually X, Y, and Z. And I'm saying, well, what if we said it's also religion? Because they're using religion to make this argument. So why don't we just accept what they're saying about their own argument to some degree, not look beyond it, but take that seriously. So so thank you for allowing me the opportunity to explain that. And in terms of Aisha's minimum marriage age, that's also another great question. And the fact is that for most Sunnis, the Sunni majority, she was very young when she got married. But it's not like and modern Muslims are now beginning to argue that she was older. And in the Shi'i tradition, there's a stronger tradition to argue that she was older for different reasons, not necessarily for gender equality reasons, but because they don't like Aisha and they think she was lying and she's making him look bad. But so there's something else going on there. But what's interesting about even if she was young, if you think of Kisha Ali's argument about the Prophet, right? Whether sometimes his sunnah, his practice is considered exemplary, and sometimes it's considered exceptional. So the fact that he's polygamous, exemplary. The fact that he marries 9 women, exceptional, because nobody else can do that. So I know it's a very provocative example, but in the case of Aisha, so Muslims were making the argument that his behavior had been exceptional, and it was not meant to be emulated by people in the future, whereas the people that were making the argument to repeal the law were arguing that it was exemplary and not exceptional. That's one sort of simple way to think about it. Thank you.
So just on the point about, I think you make a good point about these varying ideas of causality, and I don't disagree that Islamic law is certainly important. I think where we're coming at is okay, when you have these reforms to the Islamic law and the family law reform, you still don't see, do you see improvements in the status of women, and if not, what are the reasons for that? And so we found it in Morocco,
exactly.
Right? But in terms of the preliminary fieldwork we've seen for judges implementing it, these kin-based values are still very strong, despite the fact that the law has changed, and it was changed in a way that was presented to be consistent with Islamic law. So that's more of it. It's kind of like they're definitely interdependent, and the fact that Islamic law in Morocco, basically codified tribal kinship structures, and so they're interdependent, and just kind of like when you have the reform, okay, what are the obstacles you may face with them?
Well, join me in thanking our panelists and thank you all.
I'm ready for lunch.